All right. So, waiting has really come to characterize much of our lives over the last couple of years. My book was Delayed Response was published in 2018, but I started getting a lot more requests for interviews and media appearances once the pandemic hit because waiting became such a vital part of everyday life for us once the pandemic hit. We were waiting for a vaccine to arrive. We were waiting for word about when school was going to start, what it was going to look like, what was life going to be like for our children, our students. We were waiting for jobs to return. Uh, and very small things like waiting for the Zoom host to start the meeting. Some of you were waiting here in the waiting room until Megan opened up the waiting room. And we were sitting in these moments of remote connection, and our lives felt put on hold, whether it be on hold for the next customer service representative or bigger things like just waiting for life to return to normal. And I think that all of us have this feeling of ongoing delay at the moment, and we're trying to wait for normal life to return. And we, in a sense, are feeling like these buffering icons that are waiting without a very clear sense of when that waiting is going to cease. And this, I think, is a really pivotal thing about waiting is this lack of feedback that leads to us feeling bored. We feel unproductive or irritated by the way waiting makes us feel powerless or anxious or isolated or depressed. We hate to wait, even if it's for a relatively short period of time or here in our own moment, whether it's across years. So from the very few seconds that we hate to wait to these long periods of delay, waiting produces a sense of uncertainty in our lives, and we tend to try to avoid waiting at all costs. But what my argument is in the book is that we can reclaim waiting from the slow and thick doldrums of our negative encounters with it. And I think we can actually wait better. But it really does require us to have a radical reorienting of our perspectives about waiting. And waiting is something that has been something we interpret. It's not simply about an in-between time. It's something that we fill with meaning. We're constantly in the act of filling wait times and delays with meaning. They're interpretive. And this, for me, came to the fore in my own studies. I was at a conference at MIT, and a scholar of Japanese popular culture made an offhand comment about teens in the country at the time. He said that they were sending each other blank text messages on their phones. So the idea was that if you were in a romantic relationship with a partner, you would send that partner a little text message with no words, no content, nothing in it, just a little blank blip on their screen. And their job in response was to respond to that blank text message with their own blank text message. But the goal was to do it with as little time elapsed as possible. So the idea was I would ping you, and then you would ping me back immediately if you were paying attention, or if you were a romantic partner that was not paying adequate attention, the delay would sort of, fill hours in the day, and the person would feel this negative sense of disconnection, like you weren't paying enough attention to me. So all day long, the Japanese teens were sending these blank texts back and forth with no content to them. And this got me thinking about how this has been true across history, where waiting for a message was central to the message itself, where the process of waiting for word was an act of interpretation. It was something we filled with meaning. It was content in and of itself. And that, for me, as a scholar who studies media and communication, to think that communication is not words or messages, but time itself can be communicative, was a really interesting provocation that I wanted to explore. So I went to Tokyo to try to find some of the origins of this blank text message story, and went around and talked to teens and college students within Tokyo, talked to professors of media studies and mobile technology studies. And when I brought up the story of the blank text messages, I was over and over again greeted with blank stares. They had no idea what I was talking about. They said, "We don't know anything about this. It sounds interesting, sounds provocative. It sounds like something teens could do. They're constantly coming up with new ways of using their technology. So it's possible, but nobody had ever heard of it." So this story that kind of launched me into my research project of like, ooh, there's this interesting story about messages with no content and time as the content, ended up being kind of a mythology. I was never able to hunt it down. When I came back to the University of Maryland, I was chatting with a colleague about my trip to Tokyo, kind of dejected, and said, "Yeah, I wasn't able to sort of pin down the origin stories of this book." He was telling me about a moment when he was a teenager in the late 90s and 2000s in Italy. And he said, actually, a practice that we engaged in Italy was quite similar. We called it ringing, squealos. And this was when text messages, when you would send them, you'd be charged per text message. And there was no unlimited data plans, there was no unlimited texting. So every time you sent a text message, it cost you. And for teens in the country, that was just outside of their ability to pay for it. So they came up with this creative workaround where, with friends or romantic partners, you would ring their phone and you ring their cell phone, and your caller ID would pop up on the screen, and you would hang up after one ring. And then their job was to ring you back, likely with as little time elapsed as possible. And so, in essence, that Japanese text message story was something that was practiced on a daily basis for years and years. And the goal was that the ring represented content like, I'm thinking about you. Just you're in my thoughts right now. I'm aware of your presence, and I hope you're aware of mine. So ring me back when you get a chance. And my colleague said he would do this every day for years and years and years, especially with friends who were in different schools, where during, in between classes or at lunch periods, they would just ring each other. It was just kind of a nudge of like, hey, we're still connected with each other. Um, and at the end of a day, if it was a particular busy day, especially with his romantic partner, he would get home and have all of these unanswered rings. All of these people rang him throughout the day, and he had the burden of ringing people back. And it became kind of this job to keep in touch with people, this task of responding to these rings, with the understanding that the longer you waited to respond to the message, they interpreted that as neglect. And I think that's something we can all identify with when we're reaching out to loved ones, people we care about, people we're in our family, and we reach out and there's no response. That lack of response is a message in and of itself. That the delays, the wait times, we filled these with meaning. And this is, interestingly, something that we've done throughout history. So with our emails and our text messages in the contemporary moment, in the past, we have waited for messengers running or riding on horseback, letters sealed and stamped, telegrams transmitted across oceans, news updates that are printed in the morning edition. So the delay between sending and receiving a message has been historically something we've always filled with meaning. We've interpreted wait times with anxiety or hope, with fear or boredom or longing and desire, all of these emotions that we fill wait times with. And these interpretations are really powerful tools for shaping the ways that we can understand how human intimacy works, how we can think about human connection, especially when we think about mediated connection. Within my book and my research across the whole of my research, I'm really interested in asynchronous technologies. So right now we're connected synchronously in real time with each other over Zoom, and there's so many interesting affordances that gives us, so many interesting opportunities in real time to have conversation. You can see my facial gestures, I can see yours, and there's lots of nonverbal communication that's happening. But for the people who are going to watch this as a recording, or through text messages or letters, through emails, all of these media that are not happening in real time but allow people to respond when they get a chance, these are interesting objects for us to study how we connect across distances and across times as people, and how we build intimacy and try to maintain it when we're not near each other or we can't share the same time with each other, which has been a problem and a challenge we've had across history, that we are connecting with people across distances and across different times. And how do we do that? How do we actually build intimacy when we're not face to face? And the delays, the wait times become something that has been really interesting for me to study, especially in things like letters and correspondence, different moments in history, and to see how people talk about those wait times within them. So I think we can study waiting and become students of waiting, to understand how these interpretive moments help unlock even things like innovation, where we can speculate about the unknown, really unlock certain modes of creativity, and new ways of exploring, new ways of building knowledge. And that's a part of the book as well. As technology really changes the speed at which we connect with each other across distances, one of the questions I asked at the outset was, how has waiting changed for us across history? Because the technologies have shifted really dramatically, and the time signatures of these technologies have shifted in such radical ways. I was curious to wonder how people have waited in different periods of history. Have we waited differently? Have we become more impatient? Have we do we as humans at this moment in history have a very different sense of duration and delay and wait times, because of our technologies and the expectations that those build? And that all feeds into the book that was published in 2018 called Delayed Response: The Art of Waiting from the Ancient to the Instant World. And within the book, I kind of go on this archaeological dig. I start with the present moment and I work backwards through different forms of media, 7 different eras of technological history, to uncover the ways that these different technologies at different moments in history have shaped the human experience of time, using waiting as a lens to understand how we have experienced duration and time differently based on how our technologies have really shifted things. So moving from the era of the text message, I look at the emergence of the pneumatic tube mail system in 5 different cities in the United States, where in the late 1890s, in cities like New York, they would lay miles upon miles of tubing underground that would push canisters of mail with compressed air all across the city. So in Philadelphia and Boston, New York, St. Louis, Chicago, they had just miles and miles of tubing underground where people could drop a letter in the mailbox marked for pneumatic delivery, and within an hour somebody else could get it across the city, and you could shoot back an hour, and this would run all day long, and you could just send notes back and forth to each other all day long, with these canisters being shot underground at about 30 miles an hour, just zipping around the city. And in contrast, this is to with this is the normal mail delivery system. At the same exact time, this picture is from the National Archives here in DC, where I dug out all of their archival documents and photographs about the pneumatic tube system, and alongside it was pictures of the post office at the time. This is a postal delivery carrier carting around mail in his wagon, horse-drawn wagon. So right around this same time that horse-drawn wagons are delivering the mail, there are these futuristic tubes shooting canisters around the city, delivering mail within the hour. And it really felt like people were living in the future. Like we have arrived at this moment of instantaneous connection. Life has sped up. Our human ability to communicate with each other has sped up exponentially. We now can just drop a note in the mail and it's delivered in an hour. E.B. White, a couple of years before writing Charlotte's Web, has this book, Here is New York. And he writes about the pneumatic tube system and just the infrastructures that make modern life in New York City actually function at the time. He writes, "It's a miracle that New York works at all. The subterranean system of telephone cables, power lines, steam pipes, gas mains, and sewer pipes is reason enough to abandon the island to the gods and weevils. Every time an incision is made in the pavement, noisy surgeons expose ganglia that are tangled beyond belief. When a young man in Manhattan writes a letter to his girl in Brooklyn, the love message gets blown to her through a pneumatic tube, just like that. And this is a picture of the pneumatic tubes underground that was in the archives that I pulled out. So you can see that ganglia that are tangled beyond belief within the city. And this would, pipes would run across the Brooklyn Bridge and over to the Brooklyn post office. So from Manhattan to Brooklyn, you could just shoot a message over to a loved one instantly. And part of the allure of this is not simply that you're writing a love letter, it's that you're writing a love letter that's being delivered through pneumatic tubes. So the technology itself is a part of the system. It's a part of the experience of this. It's a part of the speed that becomes part of the content. So it's not just that a message was sent, but it's that it's sent in a particular kind of way, and that way has sped up the ability for us to communicate with each other. So the book works backwards from the era of mobile fiber optics, but also looks at the relationship between communication and knowledge, how we can connect with each other across distances and share ideas, but also how that's really emblematic of things like the space program, which has a totally dramatic sense of time and duration and delay as well built into it. I was really interested in working with the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, the mission operations team that sent the New Horizons spacecraft in the Pluto flyby and is now out in the Kuiper Belt, and talking with them about the ways that wait times are really integral to how we develop any sort of understanding about the universe, that communicating with spacecraft in distant space is emblematic of how knowledge production works, about the need for us to be able to build in delays and wait times as a mode of learning new things. And if you think about how cultures have shared knowledge across geographic distances and the delays that are built into that, the chapter also looks at the ways that delays are really fundamental toward how we move knowledge from short-term memory to long-term memory, which requires delay, it requires pauses, it requires a chemical process in the brain of dealing with RNA that ultimately moves an idea from the short-term memory into the long-term memory, and it requires delay, it requires pause. And for me, building knowledge is really so intimately intertwined with delays and wait times, and are not the enemy of knowledge. Instead, it's a fundamental part of how we do it. So I look at the space program and how we develop knowledge alongside delay. I look at Civil War letters, which were, the Civil War was such a really interesting moment for our country when it came to how we communicated across distances. You had millions of people moving away from home to different parts of the country to fight in this war, writing letters at an unprecedented scale. So prior to the Civil War in 1847, the U.S. Postal Service created postage stamps that were inexpensive and allowed people to write in an affordable way. And this then led to soldiers being able to write just every day from whatever camp that they were in. And I look in particular at Joseph Coriel, who's a soldier in the Army of the Potomac, who's fighting in Fredericksburg and writing home to his wife in Michigan. And the back and forth between these this married couple as, again, emblematic of how people continued to maintain intimacy across these geographic distances. And it created a rhythm of life. It created a rhythm of connection as people wrote to each other every day and received letters every day. And when pauses were built into wartime letters, those pauses were deeply interpretive. I haven't heard from you. I'm very concerned about where you are, what's happening to you. There was a woman in Tennessee, writing to her soldier boyfriend, and he stops writing just out of the blue. And she feels very shunned by this, and she writes this dramatic letter to him, like, "What did I do to offend you? Please just let me know what I said that ruined our relationship, because you have just stopped writing to me, and I'm concerned that I did something to cause a rift between us." He was actually captured as a prisoner of war, was in a camp out here in the mid-Atlantic, and she eventually found out that he was prisoner of war. But for that duration, I think it was about 3 months, she was just distraught that she had done something to offend him, until she finds out, and they did eventually reconnect and get married. But that delay of connection, that breakage, and the ways that we interpret those wait times are really interesting to study in terms of how we connect as humans. I go back to look at the ways that people have connected across geographic distances and embodied themselves across these distances, with documentation and sort of marking the body through medieval wax seals, to kind of sign their presence to these things, the ways that we might have like a read receipt on a text message. And I go back to the very first mobile technologies that we ever had, which are Aboriginal message sticks in Australia. And these message sticks were used to communicate between Aboriginal tribes as they began migrating onto the continent of Australia to share knowledge, to connect with each other, to be able to navigate this harsh landscape and collaborate with it, using these sophisticated communication networks that started as far back as 40 to 55,000 years ago. So looking back at how people have communicated long distance across tens of thousands of years as a way to really share knowledge, to connect and build out these intimacies. And time is and wait times are a part of what Stuart Hall would call chronemics, which is the study of, the cultural study of time and how we perceive time. So Edward T. Hall writes that time talks. It speaks more plainly than words. The message it conveys comes through loud and clear because it is manipulated less consciously, and it is subject to less distortion than the spoken language. It can shout truth where words lie. So waiting is not an in-between time. I think this was the big takeaway. Instead, it's a silent force that's really shaping our lives and the connections that we have with other people. And what is interesting is designed into the technologies that we are using these days with our mobile technologies. The wait times are built right into it. There are around 8 billion mobile subscriptions worldwide on the planet right now. And the majority of the world thus has a tool that can connect them instantly with other people. What's interesting as a result of this is the emergence of how this feeds into our perception of time, the human perception of time on a day-to-day basis. When we're dealing with our phones, some studies that have been done recently, including one that I did with undergraduate and graduate students in North America, we are unlocking our phones about 150 times a day. And when we send a message to someone, the typical student that I worked with at the undergraduate and graduate level expects a response within about 5 minutes. Because the phone is on people all the time, they expect, because people are unlocking their phones so often, they're gonna see a message. And if they can't respond right away, they should be able to respond soon thereafter. And the typical expectation is around 5 minutes. And we are tapping and clicking and swiping our phones 2,600 times in a day. So we're deeply connected to these technologies. And this last number, this $2,600, is 2,600 times that we're tapping and clicking and swiping our phones is across all age ranges, all mobile users, not just students. So we are actually in this mobile era sending text messages more than we are talking in real time. We're spending more time on text than we are actually having synchronous phone conversation, and that has been true since 2009. When people began using their phones more for data services like email and text than they are for synchronous voice communication. So waiting is built into the very fabric of mobile life, of mobile technology, and how we use it on a day-to-day basis. But we absolutely hate waiting. It's so interesting that we're using our phones this way when we hate to wait. But we're actually choosing media that make us wait. We're not picking up the phone and calling. We're actually texting, which has waiting built into the very nature of it. But we hate to wait. So this disconnect is really interesting to me because waiting does create anxiety about how long we will be left waiting, especially when there isn't much feedback about waiting, about how long it is until our waiting will cease. And we can kind of build those into our relationships, but ultimately we are left within a system that doesn't provide very clear feedback about when wait times will cease. And the interesting story for me around this emerged in post-World War II New York City when skyscrapers began just really popping up all around the city, and elevators were a fundamental part of life in New York City at the time. There was one building in particular that the wait times for the elevators seemed to just drag on, and people began complaining to the building's manager. So the building's manager realized that there's an issue. He calls in engineers, the elevator company, to help fix the problem. People are waiting too long for the elevators here. We need you to fix it. And the elevator companies and engineers come back and say, this is an unsolvable problem. This is just how these elevators are working. We can't make them go faster. It's a dynamic system that stops at different floors. So there was a psychologist in the building who approached the manager and said, I have an experiment I'd like to try. If you're open to it, I think might solve our problems. And so what he did was he put mirrors up around the lobby, around the elevators, and the complaints ceased immediately. What happened was people were standing around the elevators all of a sudden with something to do. The psychologist within the building realized that people were bored and they didn't have a sense of when their waiting would end, and it made them anxious. And so by giving them something to do, to look at themselves in the mirror, to look at other people in the mirror, they began to be able to occupy themselves during this wait time. And some people actually even went so far as to congratulate the building's manager on solving the problem because the perception of wait time differed so dramatically. And you can see this, companies are responding in similar kind of ways, where airlines received a lot of complaints about baggage delays at the as you would go and wait for your luggage. And so what they did was they made people, and they currently employ this, where they make people walk further to get to the luggage, so there's less wait time. So the perception of waiting decreases because it takes you longer to get to the site for baggage. So if you can build in strategies for how to deal with delay, this is really helps with the perception of it. And the elevator example, I think, is really key because there isn't a very clear feedback loop here about when your waiting will cease, and that does build anxiety over this, because waiting can ultimately make us feel powerless and frustrated, regardless of the of the shortness of that. And when I'm talking about the shortness of waiting, I'm quite serious about how we are trying to avoid waiting at all costs. Amazon did a study where if on average customers are made to wait a tenth of a second on their site, they can lose up to 1% of their revenue. Because of the perceptions of waiting, people click away, and it's very short. A tenth of a second is about as long as it takes for a sensation to go from a nerve ending to your brain. It's very, very fast. But we are building in these expectations around how our technology should work, and it can lead to a direct drop in revenue if people are perceiving that they're waiting too long. And perception here is really very much at a fundamental level. Your Google searches have typically pop up with 10 results. Many years ago, Google tried to increase that. They tried to make the they tried to double the amount of search results you'd get on their page, but it slowed it down by a half second. And this led to, this was just a study, it was not ever launched, but within their group that they were studying, it led to a traffic drop of 20% just by delaying this by a half second. So the ultimately tech companies are using waiting as a way to drive us toward their product, but also waiting is potentially the the bug in the system that drives users away. And this is this really interesting contradiction that waiting is both an opportunity for technology companies to draw us to their product, to have us kind of fiddle on our phones and occupy our time with our screens. But if there's too much waiting built into our everyday lives and too much waiting built into the products that we're interacting with, the companies can lose users and lose revenue. So conversely, waiting is a thing that needs to be eliminated, and alongside that is the opportunity for companies to utilize it. So the mythologies of the digital age really center around the idea that waiting is the antithesis of our moment. That technological innovation should eliminate waiting. We should be able to connect with each other instantly. We should be able to get the things that we want instantly. But also waiting is calibrating our lives to particular notions of efficiency that in a single gesture both demonize waiting while preying on it as an opportune moment to occupy our attention. So for me, waiting is something that I have kind of sought to become a student of. I want to study these moments of waiting, because waiting is really thick and noticeable. It's slow. It calls attention to itself, unlike other kinds of experiences and perceptions of time. And I think if we begin to pay attention to wait times, it can really be an instructive teacher. It can teach us about power dynamics in relationships and within cultures, who is being forced to wait and who gets to skip the line altogether. It can teach us about cultural notions of productivity and efficiency, and the ways that waiting is being eliminated from the work we do. And actually, waiting can be a very powerful tool for innovation and creative thinking. It allows us to unlock new modes of thinking and new modes of creativity. Waiting can show us how knowledge is produced, and waiting is linked with how we just experience time and our own sense of busyness and anxiousness. And I think we can pull back and begin to study it in unique ways. So I want to end today with some tactics of waiting that are things that I've been employing, and I suggest in the book, in the concluding chapter of the book, called Tactics for Waiting. How do we deal with this? What do we do when we're confronted with waiting? How do we become students of waiting? So wait time is instructive, but I think first and foremost, we have to allow ourselves to wait, which is much, much harder than it sounds, because we have built, especially in our culture, we have built in the mechanism to flee waiting whenever possible. Waiting for us is something we try to avoid at all costs. But in order to become students of waiting, we actually have to let ourselves wait and recognize those moments where we do tend to flee from it, and pause and use that as a moment of analysis. So I wanted to talk about some tactics here that I employ and encourage people to employ. The first is very basic, but it is just asking yourself, why am I waiting? And the initial answers are typically pretty shallow. Shallow answers to a complex situation, because you may be waiting because a friend is running late, or you may be waiting because a boss is finishing up a previous meeting, or the train runs every 20 minutes on the weekends and you didn't get there in time to get on the train, or the restaurant is slammed and packed and the kitchen is filled with orders and you are one of many. So just recognizing here is the situation. But as soon as you recognize the situation around waiting, the following question I always ask, that I find to be quite useful, is who benefits from my waiting? And sometimes the answer is we do. We benefit from our waiting at moments. Waiting is often understood to be an investment, where you have delayed gratification as a concept, where instead of fulfilling, the thing you desire right now, if you wait, you get something better on the other side of your waiting. It builds patience. It builds equity. If you invest in the stock market, you're going to have to wait this moment out because things are very rough. And if you were to try to pull your money out, this is not the moment to do that. Instead, waiting is something that can build equity. So sometimes you're the beneficiary of your waiting room, but waiting might actually reveal structural benefits to other people, to systems that keep people disempowered. I studied waiting rooms in South America, for example, was one of the examples that I looked into. And as people would sit in these waiting rooms, the design of them reiterated the power dynamics of who was in charge in this space. As people were waiting for government subsidies to help them out of poverty, they would sometimes take days off of work to go and get a check, but there was no clear sense, are you going to get what you came for that day? There's no feedback system. There's not even enough chairs in the room for everybody to sit. And so you are left in limbo within this space. It's a space that does not provide you feedback. It just continually makes you feel more and more disempowered. So designs of waiting can sometimes remind people about who's in charge and sort of the power dynamics within a culture. And you can identify the different hierarchies within a culture because of the ways that spaces are designed and people are sometimes forced to wait. And this is also true of romantic relationships. Roland Barthes has a really fantastic book called Lover's Discourse. And in that he writes, "Am I in love? Yes, since I am waiting. The other never waits. Sometimes I want to play the part of the one who doesn't wait. I try to busy myself elsewhere to arrive late, but I always lose at this game. Whatever I do, I find myself there with nothing to do, punctual, even ahead of time. The lover's fatal identity is precisely, I am the one who waits." So within romantic relationships, who is claiming priority of time? Is there an asymmetry there between who gets to wait, who is forcing others to wait, who is expecting people to bend around their time? Is there a power asymmetry within a relationship because of how time is being exercised within there? And for me, what this has led me to do is often ask myself, am I making other people wait? Am I exercising my own privilege within a relationship to claim dominance of time within them? So there are two themes that emerge here: that waiting is a way that power is exercised, but also that waiting is a collective experience of time. I think one of our reasons for feeling that waiting is a burden is because we often believe that our time is unique from other people's time. Especially in Western contemporary societies, we tend to value an individual experience of time rather than a collective experience of time. And this really became apparent to me when I was in a grocery store checkout line, and the woman, who was a couple of people in front of me on a Sunday afternoon, was checking out. She had a child in the cart with her, and she was paying for her groceries in part with cash and in part with food stamps. And then she was also asking the clerk to go over all of the coupons to make sure everything was counted. And the people in line with me were so disgruntled at being forced to wait, as this woman had to go through all of this rigmarole around saving money, and were very irritated. And then when a manager had to come over to kind of deal with one of the coupons that wasn't working, people were turning around and looking at me like, oh my God, this is so ridiculous. And what was interesting to me at that time is all of us in that line were really prioritizing this individual experience of time rather than a collective experience of time. When I reflect on that, I realize that that woman is being forced to use time in a way that I don't have to. That her experiences of time are very unique from mine. You often hear the phrase that we're all given 24 hours, and how you use those 24 hours really determines success. But we are not all given the same 24 hours. People are being forced to use that time in dramatically different ways. People have to take two different buses to get to work. That takes them hours, and I can hop in my car and drive down to UMD and be there in 30 minutes. So my experience of a commute takes a different amount of time from somebody else who's potentially working 2 or 3 jobs. So by approaching things through trying to experience a collective sense of time, I can invest myself in other people's circumstances. I think it has the potential to build radical empathy. If we can look at other people's time and the ways that they're being forced to use their time in ways that are different from me, I think that it has a chance to be able to help us identify moments of disempowerment because of how people are used time. Sarah Sharma, a communication scholar, calls this temporal awareness of how my time is intertwined with your time. And to build up a collective sense of time rather than an individual one, working toward collective time, which is an awareness of the impact of waiting, that it has the radical potential to build empathy and a call to social change if we realize that not everyone is afforded the same agency for how time gets used. And you see this in moments of the long recovery efforts around hurricane relief, for example, like Katrina in 2005 or Maria in 2017, where power is just out in Puerto Rico for months and months and months. And, identifying why you're waiting, who benefits from the waiting, but seeing wait times as collective and, identifying and resisting moments where people are being asked to wait that perpetuate social inequality. I think we can really imagine studying waiting to say these people are disempowered because of the ways they're being asked to use time. They're being forced to wait in ways that I don't have to. And we can identify that as a moment of disconnect, of inequity, and we can fight against those wait times. Waiting is not always beneficial. Sometimes it really does create inequities between romantic partners and socially on very much larger scales. Another tactic is asking ourselves how wait times reveal our hopes for the future. So what I do is often when I'm in a moment of waiting, I ask myself, what do I hope comes on the other side of waiting? What do I hope arrives on the other side? And I can learn a lot about myself and my desires and my hopes for the future by asking this question. And I think about the buffering icon and our how we hate buffering. Buffering becomes kind of this aggravating moment, and in these moments of time, just to ask what we hope comes on the other side of waiting. And this question came up to me when I was I'm not on Facebook anymore these days, but several years ago when I was trying to reload Facebook and it was just a buffering icon, nothing was popping up, and I was feeling sort of anxious about it. I paused and I asked myself, well, what do I hope Facebook reveals to me once the buffering stops? And I realized that I was hoping for some kind of social authenticity, some kind of social connection. And I realized that that actually wasn't going to arrive, which I think in part led to me kind of abandoning Facebook altogether, because when I realized that my hopes for what Facebook would provide were not being fulfilled, I looked elsewhere for that. And I think those wait times was a moment for me to reflect on it. And designers and artists are actually asking, do we need to build wait times into our everyday experiences? Like if you think about, for example, how fast the news comes at you, it doesn't give you a moment to just pause and take it in and reflect and have an opinion about it. Instead, it just comes so fast. Journalists are asking this question: how do we build wait times into our digital age? Because people are not being able to process the news at a speed that gives us the capacity for important decision making and being able to process it in ways that are beneficial to us. This is a picture of Maria Abramovich's piece called Goldberg that she did with pianist Igor Levit in New York City at the Park Avenue Armory. This was 2015 and 16. And when you walked into the Park Avenue Armory for this performance of the Goldberg Variations by Igor Levit, you were directed to a set of lockers, and you had to take your phone out, you had to take your watch off, any kind of time telling device, any sort of media, you put in the locker and you took the key with you, and you were given then a set of noise canceling headphones. And you were asked to sit in these sort of deck chairs that were in a circle around so you could kind of see everybody. And a gong was clung, and then you were then put on your headphones. And you had to wait for 30 minutes until Igor Levit came out and started playing. So the entire experience of the Goldberg Variations was preceded by 30 minutes of waiting. And Maria Abramovich, as a performance artist working with Igor Levit, said, you know, she's listening to him perform this beautiful piece. And she said, as a New Yorker, it's impossible to walk in off the streets of New York into the Park Avenue Armory and really sit in and enjoy the Goldberg Variations. She's like, it's impossible. I'm going to force you to have 30 minutes of downtime. And reading people's experience of this is really fascinating because it's kind of this variation. People fell asleep. People were just fascinated watching other people in silence and not having your phone. It was kind of this freedom for many people to not have your device on you, for being forced to just sit for a half hour was for many people incredibly liberating. And other people were very anxious about it and very uptight. And so the individual experiences of it were fascinating. But similar to Abramovich, many designers are asking, how do we build in wait times to make the human experience of time more manageable in our very fast-paced society? How do we build in waiting into our overall process? And I think that if we can build a tactics for waiting that recognize that our time is deeply intertwined with others, we can become advocates for the ways that wait times can disempower, and we can resist those times, but also understand that waiting can ultimately deeply benefit us if we allow ourselves to wait. I think if we can unpack waiting's power and its promise, its value and its danger, I think we can become people who just can learn so much from studying wait times, about our expectations about human connection, but also about what we hope for the future and how we can then ultimately build waiting into our lives as a tactic for seeing the world in dynamically new ways. And I will stop there and take any questions that you have about this. So, and Megan, I think we will use have you used the raising hand function here under reactions, or how do you prefer questions?
Yeah, so typically folks will just put the questions in the chat, but if people know how to raise their hand, you can also do that by clicking on the participant tab or reactions tab, and you can raise your hand depending on, all right, looks like Sarah has her hand raised. Sarah, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. So I'm really interested in kind of how this like the future of like wait time, particularly in the U.S. And how this kind of this dichotomy of our busyness and our discomfort with I don't even want to say like empty time, because I don't feel like that's actually a thing, but and then also with this kind of and our particularly empty time away from devices, and also the many benefits and even ways in which like a mindfulness practice and also opportunities to be very grounded without technology has emerged in our society. So I'm just kind of interested in that. I don't know if this is something that you've considered or looked into or what, but that's just something that I'm particularly interested in.
Great. Yeah, it's a really great question. How do we get here? I think is really what you're getting at. How in the world do we arrive at this moment technologically where this becomes a normal part of our experience? And as I looked back at the technological history of communication, I did expect us to be very unique compared to other eras, more impatient. And what emerged was actually the opposite. We have always been really impatient, just at different time scales. So the technologies create a cognitive sense of expectation of how long things should take. And that's really sets the baseline for the human experience of duration and time. So if a letter takes 40 days to go down the east coast of the United States in the 1790s, then you anticipate that that's the duration that it takes. And then when it takes 50 days, 45 days, that's when we begin to be really impatient. And you see people write this in their letters, like, I'm very nervous about expecting this thing that it didn't happen. So there's a sense of impatience that emerges with each technology. And you can see this traced back to Seneca and the Roman Empire. Seneca was somebody who was at this pivotal moment in history of bureaucracy related to documentation, where documents about everything began to fill his desk. And he's like, I feel so scatterbrained. I feel a busyness of mind because of all of the documents around me. Life has become just so fast paced and I can't keep up with the documentation. The technology of the time is not something I can keep up with. And I feel a busyness of mind that is very unsettling. So I think we can trace our own experience of how we got here all the way back to Rome and prior. Every technology builds in a wait time that we have to contend with. But I do think with the rise of media on us at all time, with the rise of mobile media and smartphones around 2007, 2008, has shifted our availability. And the fact that we are reachable at all times, that has shifted our experience of time in a way that feels a little bit at a breakneck speed. And now we're going to have to build in everyday strategies for dealing with this technology, because it is new technology. It's still a very young technology in our culture, and we're kind of absorbing it into our lives, but it has shifted our use of time in ways that we are now having to contend with.
Looks like we have another question and a hand raised from Leora. Leora?
Oh, I think your microphone might be off, Leora.
Yes, you might have to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, there we
Okay.
go.
So that was fascinating. Thank you so much. The Goldberg variations after a half hour of forced waiting reminds me of the 4 minutes and 33 seconds by John Cage.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Where the whole piece was silence.
Yes.
And he wouldn't go farther than 4:33, like 50 years ago.
Right.
Imagine having people to wait 40 minutes for a piece.
Yes,
but
exactly.
Anyway, one thing that irritates me to no end is when I call and the bot answers, and there are all kinds of questions until you can get to a human.
Right.
And you can't just push 0 anymore, and you can't just say human or
right.
supervisor, whatever. And sometimes they tell you your wait time is 20 minutes.
Right.
And you're thinking, is it worth 20 minutes? And sometimes you have no choice. And then it becomes 40 minutes.
Right.
And something that usually would take a minute becomes an hour-long experience in frustration.
Yes. Yeah, yes, exactly. I think that is so true. And what we're up against at this moment is sort of the scale that technology plays in our lives and the inability for human labor to keep up with our demands of wanting answers contemporary in the moment. So they have to build in these systems to respond to people, but often those systems then shift our waiting in different kinds of ways and often extend waiting, like you said, and create waiting where waiting didn't need to exist. But I think it's all this very interesting, complex structures around how human labor is being utilized or offset in a technological age where we are expecting answers in a particular moment. How do we get our answers? And we want an answer now, and they are then building in systems to try to offload some of the human labor on the other side because there's just not enough people to
Right.
deal with our questions at the moment, and so they have to build in algorithms and bots to deal with that sometimes are just not well designed to do that. So I think we're at an interesting moment when it comes to the human labor behind a lot of our technological systems and how we're dealing with wait times. And it is interesting to think about. I remember about a decade ago, I was charged by United Airlines for something, and getting on customer service with United Airlines was
Yeah.
so difficult. It would just be like you have an hour and 45-minute wait ahead of you, and it's just music playing in the background, and you memorize that song, So I think some of these strategies are dealing with trying to occupy us while we wait, and to again sort of that distraction technique in order to give us a different perception of time in a moment, and building in a technological system to do that.
All right, in our last minute, we have one last question. Thank you for waiting, Alan. With devices making our wait times now quote unquote productive, is there a relationship to impatience and even ADHD? And this will be our last question for the day.
Yeah, and I think these questions link up, especially around labor, around what it means to be a productive employee. And I've worked with businesses around waiting and how to build in waiting. We do have notions of efficiency and productivity that try to get rid of waiting, that waiting is actually the antithesis of good work. And what I have found actually is that if you build wait times into your workday, you are more creative and less burned out. And you come up with innovative solutions to problems that you can't see if you're really bogged down with things. So I think the impatience, even sort of the experience that ADHD have of bouncing between things and never quite settling on something, and being forced to jump between tabs and different things sort of catching our attention at different moments in time and never being able to sit and finish something, is very much related to this moment and the notions of productivity, where we feel productive when we're jumping between tabs, answering our phones, but ultimately we're using our times in wildly inefficient ways. And one thing that has emerged that I have found interesting in the work around the cognitive science of how of wait times is that delays and daydreaming and pauses is something that unlocks what's called the default network of the brain. It's called the imagination network. It's why you come up with a really innovative solution to something when you're standing in the shower or driving in traffic, because your mind is not occupied by anything else. You're sort of daydreaming, and it unlocks and leads you to answers that you could not have sought out otherwise. The default network and the imagination network only kicks in when you're daydreaming and in a pause and in a wait time. And if you can build this into your workday and have, even if you have employees or if you're in a work environment, to build in downtime will actually make you more productive and make you more efficient. And we just don't see this. We imagine that the harder you grind out your work, the better. But actually it produces less innovative, less interesting, and a burned out workforce ultimately. And so I think waiting can really help us in our day-to-day work life if we can build in techniques like the Pomodoro technique, where you work for 20 minutes and take a 5-minute break. Really helps us come up with new ways of doing the work that we do on a day-to-day basis.
Well, thank you so much. I believe that was most of our questions. There was some chat going on, but mostly just comments talking about how this was a fascinating webinar. I agree. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Farman, and for all of those tuning in across the country.
Excuse me. There was one question about ADHD and waiting, and I would like an answer to that.
I believe you just answered that, Dr. Farman, yes?
Yeah. So, and in terms of the sort of physiological linkages between those things, yeah, that's a bit outside of my realm of expertise. So I don't know that I can answer, like, is the rise of ADHD related to our contemporary relationships to waiting? It's an interesting question. Yeah, one I don't really have an answer to, unfortunately, though. It's a good.
No, I was just wondering if in your research for this book, you came across anything.
Yeah, not along those lines. I did not.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Like I said, there will be a recording of this sent to your emails, and take care. Go Terps. Thanks everyone for joining. Bye-bye.
Bye.